The gallery at dawn was the quietest room in Haverstock Hall, and Dorothy Fane had learned to love it for precisely that reason. She came early, before the household had properly woken, when the long windows along the north wall held only gray light, and the smell of the room was cold stone and linseed oil and the faint, particular mustiness of old wool. The tapestry hung between two pilasters, its edges secured to a batten frame she had rigged herself with Mr. Forday. Poole's reluctant assistance, and she sat before it on a low stool with her work-basket open at her feet, and her needle threaded with fine wool in a shade. She had mixed herself 3 parts faded ochre to 1 part rust to match the original. The tapestry was a hunting scene, horses and hounds, and a sky that had once been blue and was now the color of old pewter. At its lower border ran a decorative band of intertwined oak leaves, and within that band, in lettering that had nearly dissolved into the surrounding wool, a motto in Latin that Dorothy had spent 3 days deciphering and 2 more mornings beginning to restore. She had not told anyone yet what the motto said. She was not certain they would think it worth preserving. She heard his step in the corridor before she heard the door. The Earl of Haverstock moved quietly for a man of his frame, but the gallery floorboards had a particular pitch, and Dorothy had been listening to the house long enough to know which sounds belonged to which person, and at which hour. She did not look up. She kept her needle moving in the small, careful motion that took her inside a kind of silence nothing else produced, and she waited. He came to stand, perhaps 4 feet to her left, where the morning light fell cleanest on the tapestry. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, without looking at it directly, aware of a warmth of presence and the changed quality of the air. "You are here earlier than I expected," he said. "The light is better before 8 o'clock," she said. "The north window gives an even gray that shows the original colors more accurately than afternoon sun." There was a pause, in which he appeared to examine this information. "You came yesterday at this hour as well," he said. "It was not a question I did." My lord, he moved 1 step closer, and she felt rather than saw him tilt his head slightly. To read the border. She kept her needle moving. The thread pulled through the wool with a whisper, and her finger pressed the new stitch flat before the next one began. "The motto," he said. "Can you make it out?" "Most of it," she said. There is a verb in the second phrase that has deteriorated past certainty. "I am making an educated restoration." What does it say? The portion you are certain of. She considered whether to tell him, and decided the truth was always the safer choice. "Something of this nature," she said. "What endures here was earned here. The disputed word may be tended, or built, or held. I have chosen tended." He was quiet for a moment. Dorothy felt the quality of his attention shift in a way she could not have named, only registered, the way one registers a change in weather before the clouds have shown it. "Yes," he said at last. "Tended is correct. He left before the household came to life, and she did not see him again until that afternoon. If you are staying for what comes after that dawn, then you already know the house has secrets worth keeping. So does the needle." She had come to Haverstock Hall in the 2nd week of October, in the year that her father had been dead 18 months, and her own situation had clarified itself into something she could no longer refuse to see plainly. Her father, Mr. Trand, Arthur Fane, had been a man of modest means and immodest learning, a former schoolmaster who had inherited a small property in Shropshire and spent the latter years of his life attempting to improve it in ways that outpaced his income. He had died owing money to 2 merchants and 1 solicitor, and the property had been sold to cover the debts with very little left over. Dorothy had been 21 at the time of his death, and 22 by the time the accounts were settled, and what she had inherited from him was not money, but skill. His library, which she had read entirely, his habit of precision, which she had absorbed entirely, and his talent with a needle, which he had possessed in a minor way, and she in a notable one. She had also inherited, though she had not asked for it, the whisper that attended his name. The business dispute that had clouded his last year of life involved a contract for wool supplies to a manufacturing concern in Shrewsbury, and the suggestion had been made, never openly, never formally, that Arthur Fane had misrepresented the quality of what he sold. The suggestion was not proved. It was also never cleared. It lived in the space between those two facts, feeding on them equally. And Dorothy had learned that a rumor of that particular kind, attached to a dead man who could not defend himself, tended to become the permanent truth in people's minds, whether it had ever been true or not. She did not speak of it. She carried it the way one carries a stone in a boot, aware of it at every step, giving no outward sign. Agnes Pryor. The head needlewoman at Haverstock Hall had known Dorothy's work before. She knew Dorothy, having seen a piece of ecclesiastical embroidery Dorothy had completed for a church in Ludlow. And it was Agnes who had sent the letter inquiring whether she might be available for a restoration commission. The tapestry had been brought down from one of the upper rooms where it had hung since the late Earl's time, and it was in a condition that required someone with patience, a fine eye for period technique, and the ability to work in near silence for 6 to 8 hours at a stretch. Agnes had assessed Dorothy's qualifications in the parlor of the servants' hall on her first morning, and declared herself satisfied with a brevity that Dorothy recognized as the highest form of compliment. The household itself she had assessed more slowly. Lady Alderton had come to Haverstock Hall the previous spring, following the death of her own husband, Lord Alderton, and she had installed herself with the particular authority of a woman who understood her position precisely and intended to make full use of it. She was the Earl's aunt by marriage, sufficiently senior in the house to manage its social arrangements, and she had arranged, in the way that such women arranged such things for a young lady named Miss Cecily Haig, to be present at the hall for a fortnight's visit beginning in November. Miss Haig was well-connected, pleasant in manner, and entirely suitable. Lady Alderton had made clear that she considered the matter essentially settled. Dorothy had been in the drawing-room once, retrieving a spool of thread Agnes had left there, when she had heard Lady Alderton describe the tapestry commission to Miss Haig. "The needlewoman is in the gallery most mornings," Lady Alderton had said, in the tone of one noting the presence of a piece of furniture. "You need not concern yourself with her. She will be done and gone well before Christmas." Dorothy had taken her thread and gone. The tapestry's hunting scene occupied most of its surface, but it was the border that held her. The more she worked on it, the more she understood that the border had been made by a different hand than the main field. Someone later, someone who had added the oak leaf decoration and the motto after the original hanging had aged, restoring the whole with a sensibility that was not quite contemporary to the original design, but was entirely committed to the house. What endures here was tended here. The person who had added the motto had not signed their work. Dorothy found herself wondering about them, the way one wonders about a note left in the margin of an old book. Who sat here? At what hour and what season? And why this particular phrase? She was beginning to understand that she was asking about herself. The Earl came to the gallery 3 times in the first fortnight, always alone, always in the early morning or at the closing of the day. He did not ask her to stop work. He did not linger long. He asked specific questions about the restoration process, about the age of the dyes, once about whether she could estimate how old the border was in relation to the main field. She told him her best assessment. He listened to it as though it mattered. She was not accustomed to that. On his second visit he brought a candle, though there was still enough daylight at the window, and he held it at the level of the border so that the light fell parallel to the surface of the wool rather than onto it, which was the correct way to read the texture of aged textile. She noticed this without comment. A man who knew how to light a textile was a man who had learned it from someone or from solitary study, and either way it told her something. "The border thread," he said. "It is a different weight than the main field. Yes, a later hand, possibly 20 years after the original, possibly more. The dye sources differ. The ochre in the border used weld. The ochre in the field used woad, mordanted with alum. You can see the difference in how they have aged. The weld has maintained more warmth. He held the candle closer, examining the place she indicated. She was very aware of him at that proximity, aware of the controlled stillness of a man who moved carefully in spaces that contained things that could be damaged. His shoulder was perhaps 8 inches from her own. The warmth of the candle reached her wrist. "You know a great deal," he said, "about the history of dyes." "My father had books on it," she said. He was interested in the history of craft. He believed the things people made with their hands were a more honest record of a period than most of what was written about it. There was a pause. She heard him consider the statement. He was correct, the Earl said, and moved the candle to examine another section of the border. She told him her best assessment. He listened to it as though it mattered. She was not accustomed to that. "Stop," he said one morning when she had risen to take her work-basket to the window for better light, and had stumbled slightly on the uneven flagstone near the pilaster. He was across the room before she had steadied herself, and his hand was at her elbow for a single brief moment. And then it was not. "The stone there," he said. "It has been uneven since my father's time. I should have had it set." He stepped back. The warmth of the contact remained on her arm for longer than made sense. "I am quite all right," she said. "I know," he said. "Come inside from the window. The light will serve well enough from the stool." It was a command. She registered that it was a command, and she registered, beneath that, something she did not examine closely, which was that the command was made in the particular voice of a man who is accustomed to being obeyed and was using that voice in the service of keeping her from harm. She returned to the stool. She threaded her needle. She did not speak again until she was certain her voice would be steady. On his third visit, at the close of a gray Tuesday afternoon, he came in and stood before the tapestry in silence for several minutes while she worked. She did not offer conversation. She had learned that he was not a man who required conversation to make a silence comfortable, which was a quality she had encountered rarely. Most people filled silences because they were afraid of them. He let them exist, the way one lets a fire exist, without needing to add to it constantly in order to believe it is still burning. "My wife liked this room," he said. Dorothy's needle continued its small, steady motion. She did not look up. "It faces north," he said, which she preferred in summer. She found the south-facing rooms oppressive by July. He paused. "She died in the summer 2 years ago now." "I am sorry," Dorothy said, and meant it without elaboration. He was quiet. She heard in the quality of his silence something that was not grief exactly, but was the shape grief leaves behind when it has been lived with long enough to become a kind of permanent weather, always present, not always painful, impossible to imagine not having. "The portrait in the corridor," he said after a moment, "has been turned slightly. I did it myself last winter. I found I could not pass it easily." He said it without particular emotion, the way one states a fact about a piece of furniture. "I have not put it straight again." Dorothy set her needle down on the edge of the frame. She looked at the tapestry rather than at him, which seemed to her the correct way to receive a confidence of that nature, not making it more significant by meeting his eyes, not making it less significant by looking away entirely. "Some things," she said carefully, "take the time they take." He did not reply immediately. When he did, his voice was level and entirely controlled, which was, she was beginning to understand, the register he used when something had moved him. "Yes," he said, "they do." "Two? Why?" He left when the light at the window had gone entirely gray, and Dorothy sat for a moment in the near dark before she reached for the candle he had left on the ledge, and lit it, and returned to the border. The tapestry gave her something to look at that was not his face. The thing that changed her understanding of the house arrived on a Tuesday morning when she was setting out her work-basket in the gallery and noticed, beneath the edge of the tapestry frame, where it rested against the wainscoting, a small brooch. It was gold, with a pale blue enamel center, and it had clearly been there for some time. Judging by the dust at its edge, she picked it up and turned it in her hand. The clasp was fine work, considerably finer than anything she wore, and the enamel depicted a small forget-me-not in a shade that had not faded. She did not put it in her pocket. She did not leave it where it had been. She wrapped it in a piece of clean linen from her work basket and carried it to Mr. Poole in the steward's office at the end of the morning. "I found this beneath the tapestry frame," she said. "I believe it belongs to someone in the family." Mr. Poole looked at it for a long moment. His expression did not change in any way that could be described, but Dorothy had the impression that something shifted behind it, carefully, the way a large piece of furniture shifts when someone rearranges a room. "Yes," he said. "Thank you, Miss Fane." She returned to the gallery and to the border. She did not know that the Earl had been passing the steward's office and had heard her, or that he had stopped in the corridor for a moment after she had gone, or that the brooch was one he would have recognized as Clara's. She did not know any of it. She threaded her needle in the cold morning light and set herself the task of the second phrase of the motto, the disputed verb, and she chose tended, because it seemed to her the most honest word for what was done with love that had no other way to show itself. She had been thinking about the border for 7 days before she admitted to herself what she meant to do. It was not reckless. She told herself it was not reckless. The gallery was not a public room. The tapestry would hang in a corridor or above a fireplace in a secondary chamber, and it would not be examined closely. And, in 20 years, the restoration stitching would have settled into the surrounding wool until it was indistinguishable from the original, and no one would know. She was not inscribing her name on a drawing-room wall. She was adding a sentence to a language that had already been spoken here, in this wool, by someone else who had sat where she sat and decided to leave a truth behind. The motto occupied most of the lower border. The oak leaf framing that surrounded it contained in several places small pendant ornaments, tiny acorns precisely worked, and a repeating pattern that she recognized as a stylized thistle. There was space within the larger ornamental panel at the left corner where the framing grew denser, where the decoration had not been as severely damaged and had required less extensive restoration, and where, if she worked very small and very carefully, using thread the same shade as the surrounding field, a short sentence would be entirely invisible to anyone passing the tapestry in a corridor, or looking at it from more than 3 feet away. She would have to be very close. She would have to want to find it. She began on a Thursday. She worked the letters as she had been taught to work small text in ecclesiastical embroidery, working fine stem stitch no thicker than a hair, each letter no more than 1/4 of an inch in height, the spaces between words marked by the existing ornament rather than a visible gap. She worked slowly. She was not in any hurry. She was doing this because she understood with the clear and unadorned comprehension that had been her father's best gift to her, that she would leave this house and she would not say what she meant, and the alternative to stitching it into the border was to carry it with her as one more thing that had gone unspoken, and she was tired. Very quietly and deeply tired of carrying things that had not been given room. She wrote, "I worked within this house, and was made glad by it, and by one who moves through it, as though he does not know he is the warmth the rooms have been waiting for." It was more than 12 words. It was not a declaration in the conventional sense, it was the truth. And it was small enough to live in the corner of an oak leaf border where no one would look. She finished the ornamental panel on a Saturday morning and stood back from the tapestry and looked at it for a long time. The border was complete. Every inch of the damaged section had been restored. The new stitching lay flat and even against the surrounding wool, and the color she had mixed held well, the ochre warm and aged without being dull, and the text of the motto ran legibly the full length of the lower band. In the left corner, within the oak leaf frame, the ornamental pendant she had extended by 3 inches to create the panel was indistinguishable from the original decorative vocabulary. Precisely in its center, in stem stitch no thicker than a thread of hair, her sentence was complete. She did not feel foolish. She had expected to, standing before the finished work with the sentence there and permanent and unchangeable, but what she felt instead was something closer to the quality of silence that follows a long piece of music. The silence that is not empty, but is full of everything that has just been sounded. Agnes came to stand beside her. "It is the finest border work I have seen in 30 years, Agnes said. The new work does not read as new. That is very rare. Thank you, Dorothy said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded at her front in the posture she used when she was thinking something she had not yet decided to say. I have been in this house, Agnes said at last, since the old Earl's time. I was here when the present Earl was born. I have watched 3 generations of this family move through these rooms. She paused. Some of them have known what they had, others have not. She said nothing more. Dorothy understood that nothing more was required. Agnes looked at her sideways with the particular look of a woman who had seen many things and chose her moments carefully. You have been here long enough, Agnes said. That leaving will cost something. Dorothy did not answer. The leaves outside the gallery window had come down in the last week, and the grounds were bare and brown and beginning to show the thin, hard lines of winter. She was aware that Miss Haig arrived on Monday. She was aware that the commission was complete. She was aware, with the flat and unadorned clarity that had been her constant companion since her father's death, that the 2 facts together meant she had at most another week in this house, and then the house would go on as it had always gone on, and she would go somewhere else and do other work. And the sentence in the border would remain here in her absence as the most honest thing she had owned. The dinner on Monday evening was the occasion on which Dorothy understood that her time at Haverstock Hall was ending. She was not at the dinner, of course. She ate in the servants' hall with Agnes and the other household staff, and she knew the composition of the dinner table above only by what Mr. Poole reported in his usual flat and uninformative way. She heard later that evening what Lady Alderton had said, because the footman who served the first course had also overheard it, and was not a man who kept things to himself. Lady Alderton had been telling Miss Haig about the tapestry's restoration. We engaged a needlewoman, Lady Alderton had said, who has done competent work. She is nearly done. The needlewoman will be paid and gone by Friday, and we will have the tapestry hung in the great hall for the reception. Dorothy received this information from the footman with the expression she wore for receiving all such information, which was no expression at all. It was the following morning that Mr. Poole came to find her, at her work with a message that was delivered in his usual flat tone, but that conveyed, she thought, an additional weight. A guest of Lady Alderton's, Mr. Poole said. Mr. Poole, Pemberton remarked at breakfast this morning that the tapestry's restoration was, in his view, creditable work for a serving woman. I thought you should know that the remark was made, and the manner in which it was made. Dorothy held her needle still. She understood from Mr. Poole's careful precision that the manner in which it was made had been contemptuous. Thank you, she said. I also wish to tell you, Mr. Saxher, Poole said in the same flat tone, that the tapestry is to be hung in the great hall on Wednesday, in preparation for Friday's reception. Your commission will therefore conclude. She thanked him again, and he left, and she sat for a moment with her needle resting against the back of her hand. The confession was in the border. The border was about to hang in the great hall of Haverstock Hall. She had stitched her heart into a corner of an oak-leaf panel at the lower left edge of a tapestry belonging to a man who did not know it was there, and she would be paid and gone by Friday, and the tapestry would hang in this house for another 200 years, and no one would ever read what she had written. That was what she had intended. She had not changed her mind. She was merely sitting with the weight of it, which was heavier than she had expected. She thought of her father, which she had been trying not to do. She thought of the way he had sat at his desk in the evenings with the lamp lit, not working but thinking, turning a pen in his fingers. He had been a man who believed in the accuracy of things. The accurate account, the accurate weight, the accurate word. He had told her once that the most important thing about a piece of needlework was not that it was beautiful, but that it was honest. Meaning that the stitches on the back of the work were as fine as the stitches on the front, that the piece did not show you one face and conceal another. She had not understood entirely what he meant at the time. She understood it now. The sentence in the border was honest on both faces. The knowledge that it existed, permanent in the wool, was not comfort exactly. It was something more structural than that. She had been carrying the weight of her own unspoken life for 2 years since his death had left her with no one to speak it to, and the act of stitching it into this particular border in this particular house had not resolved anything, but it had given the weight a location. It was no longer only in her, it was in the house. That was what she had intended. She had not changed her mind. She was merely sitting with the weight of it, which was heavier than she had expected, and which was at the same time strangely easier than the carrying had been. She folded her workbasket, closed. The commission was done. The border was restored. The motto said what it said. And in the corner of the oak leaf panel, in thread the same color as the surrounding field, a sentence remained that was the most honest thing she had ever made. She stood and straightened her back, and went to find Agnes to tell her the work was finished. The reception on Friday was for 30 guests, and the great hall was opened for the first time since the previous winter. The tapestry had been hung on the long wall between the two fireplaces, at a height where the full hunting scene could be appreciated, and the border was at eye level, which Dorothy had not anticipated. She had expected it to be higher, partially obscured, safely above casual examination. She was not invited to the reception. She stood in the corridor that adjoined the great hall with Agnes, who had been asked to confirm with Mr. Gurriest. Pool that the tapestry's hanging hardware was correctly installed, and through the open door, she could see the room filling with guests in their evening clothes, the candlelight rich and warm on the assembled company. She could also see the tapestry. She could see, as she stood in the corridor, the Earl of Haverstock on the far side of the room, in conversation with Mr. Pemberton. He had, in the 2 weeks she had known him, always given the impression of a man who held his attention in reserve, offering only what a situation required and no more. She had learned over the weeks of his visits to read the particular quality of his stillness, and what she saw now was something different. A man who had glanced at the tapestry and then glanced again. He excused himself from Mr. Pemberton. He crossed the room in the direction of the tapestry. He was not hurrying. He moved as he always moved, with the deliberateness of a man who had decided where he was going, and he came to stand before the lower border. Lady Alderton was speaking with Miss Haig near the second fireplace. She did not notice at first that the Earl had moved. Dorothy watched him from the corridor. She should have left. She had told Agnes she would go back to the servants' hall. She stood in the doorway, still, as the tapestry itself. She saw him tilt his head. She saw his eyes move along the border. She saw the precise moment when his gaze found the corner panel. He was still for a long time. Then he turned and looked toward the door of the corridor. He found her immediately, as though he had known she was there. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet, and the room was full of people and candlelight, and the sound of 30 conversations, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who had been reading very carefully and had understood every word. He crossed the room. Lady Alderton noticed his direction and moved to intercept him, with the decisive motion of a woman who has managed social situations for decades and can read a room shift before it has completed. "Charles," she said as he passed her, "Miss Haig has been hoping to speak with you about the Scottish property. She has a cousin who—" "In a moment," he said without pausing. He came to the doorway of the corridor. Dorothy had not moved. She understood that she could not speak first, that she had in fact already spoken, in a corner of an oak leaf border, and that whatever happened now would happen in his voice. "Not hers, Miss Fane," he said. "My lord." He was quiet for a moment. The sound of the reception continued behind him. 30 people who had not yet understood that something was occurring at the edge of the room. "I read the border," he said. She held herself still. Her hands were at her sides. She was wearing her plain gray dress, which was the same dress she had worn for every morning in the gallery, and she was aware, in a way, she generally kept herself from being aware, that she was a needlewoman from Shropshire, in a corridor adjacent to a great hall full of guests in evening dress. "I know," she said. "The full border," he said. "The motto and what surrounds it." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that she did not have a name for, and then he stepped back into the doorway of the great hall and he spoke in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be. "Lady Alderton," he said. "Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to introduce Miss Dorothy Fane, who has completed the restoration of this tapestry, and to whom this house is considerably in debt for the quality of her work." The room turned. 30 faces. Lady Alderton's fan stilled at a particular angle. Miss Haig looked from the Earl to Dorothy and back again with an expression of careful recalibration. Mr. Pemberton, near the second fireplace, colored slightly. Lady Alderton said, in a voice that was entirely controlled, "The needlewoman has been— She stitched her name in this house," the Earl said, "long before I did." The room held a particular quality of silence. Lady Alderton looked at the tapestry. She looked at Dorothy. She looked at the Earl. And something in her expression, the precise, organized efficiency of it, shifted slightly, like a well-run mechanism encountering an unexpected gear. She was a woman who understood social architecture. She was beginning to understand that the architecture of this room had changed. "I see," Lady Alderton said. And then, after a moment, "Indeed." It was not precisely a concession. It was the sound of a woman who was too intelligent to fight a battle she had already lost, and who preferred strategic adjustment to public disorder. Lady Alderton had, all her life, acted in the interest of the house. She was beginning to perceive that the house might be telling her something about its own interests. "Mr. Pia." Poole appeared at Dorothy's shoulder as though he had been waiting in the corridor for exactly this moment, which she, later, understood that he had. "The late Earl's solicitor sent word this morning, Mr." Poole said in his flat, informative tone to no one in particular, and to the room in general. "Regarding a business dispute of some years ago in Shropshire, the matter has been reviewed. The fault, it appears, lay not with Mr. Fane." He said nothing further. He did not need to. The statement sat in the room with the tapestry and the candlelight, and Dorothy felt it the way one feels the moment a stone is lifted from a boot, an adjustment of weight long overdue that realigned the way she stood in her own skin. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept in front of 30 people in evening dress. Her throat was very tight all the same, and she looked at the tapestry on the wall, and she thought of her father, and she thought of what the motto said, and she understood that he would have recognized the sentence in the border, because he was the one who had taught her that the truth, carefully and skillfully placed, did not disappear. Miss Haig excused herself from the reception before 9 o'clock, with a grace that reflected well on her character and her intelligence both. She shook Dorothy's hand at the door, held it for a moment, and said quietly, "You do beautiful work." And Dorothy said, "Thank you," and meant it without any complexity whatsoever. Lady Alderton left, last of the family party. She paused beside Dorothy in the entrance hall, and she considered her for a moment with the frank appraisal of a woman who has spent 60 years assessing people accurately and is adjusting a prior assessment with intellectual honesty. "You are nothing like what I assumed," Lady Alderton said. "No," Dorothy said. "That is not a criticism," Lady Alderton said. "I know," Dorothy said. Lady Alderton nodded once, with the air of someone closing a ledger and opening a new one, and went upstairs. The great hall was nearly empty. Agnes was near the fireplace, straightening the hearth tools with the settled manner of a woman who has seen many evenings conclude and expects to see many more. The candles were burning lower, and the tapestry on the wall caught their light in a way that made the hunting scene seem to move. The horses and hounds caught in a perpetual golden moment, and at the lower border, the motto. And in the corner of the oak leaf panel, invisible from where anyone stood but present, nonetheless. One sentence that would be there when everyone in the room was gone. The Earl came to stand beside her. They stood in front of the tapestry together, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the tall windows of the great hall the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Small and tentative, sifting down through the last light from the west. "What did you believe would happen?" he said, "when you stitched it?" "Nothing," she said honestly. "I believed nothing would happen. I believed I would leave, and the words would remain, and no one would ever be the wiser." He considered this. His hands were clasped behind his back, a posture she had seen him in many times in the gallery. Standing before the tapestry in the early morning, do you regret it? She looked at the border. She looked at the place where the panel was, the corner that had cost her 3 evenings of the most careful work she had ever done. No, she said. I read it 4 times, he said, to be certain I had understood it correctly. And had you? He turned to look at her. The candlelight was warm on his face, and she saw in his expression the same quality she had registered in the gallery at dawn, on the first morning. A man who held his attention in careful reserve, and was now, quietly and irreversibly, not doing so. Yes, he said, I believe so. Agnes near the fireplace made a small sound that was not quite a cough. She was looking at the hearth tools with a concentration that was entirely unconvincing. Dorothy felt moving through her chest something she recognized as the specific relief of a sentence that has been spoken aloud after a long silence, even though the sentence had been stitched in wool and spoken to an empty room, even though she had not expected anyone to read it. The relief was the same. The truth had been given a home, and the house had not rejected it. By Christmas, the gallery was hers to sit in at any hour, not by commission, but by choice. By spring, the license had been read in the church in the village below the hall, and Agnes had wept, which she would have denied to anyone who asked. The tapestry hung in the great hall through that winter, and through the springs and autumns that came after, and the hunting scene grew gentler with each passing year, the colors settling into one another the way colors do when they are given enough time. The border held, the motto held. In the corner of the oak leaf panel, in thread the exact color of the surrounding field, a sentence held that no one had read, except the man it had been written for. On a morning in February, the snow still lying on the grounds, and the gallery windows holding the particular cold white light that came before the thaw, Dorothy sat on the low stool before the tapestry. Not to work. She had no commission here anymore, no needle in hand, no work basket open at her feet. She rested her fingertip on the oak leaf border, lightly, at the corner. The Earl came to stand beside her as he had on that first morning, and they looked at the tapestry together in the cold white light. And the house was quiet around them, and on the windowsill where she had always set it at the end of the day's work, her needle lay, small and silver, exactly where she had left it. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothy's confession moved you, let us know in a comment.